social media ethics, or how to act ethically when we're using social media professionally. So, first, I'd like to point out the difference between ethics and etiquette. So, a lot of times when you hear people use the word ethics conversationally, what they're really meaning is etiquette, the right and wrong way to behave in certain social situations. So, etiquette is the customary code of polite behavior in society, um, of a particular profession or group, right? So, like the agreed upon ways that we should act and treat each other in certain situations. Ethics is different in that ethics is a branch of philosophy that involves defending and recommending concepts of right and wrong conduct. So, ethics is really about creating rules and guidelines that allow us to act ethically when certain situations arrive. It's basically the philosophy of how do we know what is right and what is wrong in certain situations. So, when we're talking about social media ethics, we're really talking about both of these things. One is how do we establish ethical codes that can guide our behavior online? And then also, how do we have proper etiquette? What is the right and wrong thing to do when we interact with others online? So, I'd like to pose this question. Why do we need ethical standards for social media use? So, what is it about social media that makes it necessary for us to think about ethical action? And this might seem obvious, right? We should always be concerned with acting ethically if we're media professionals, right? Whether we're journalists, whether we're broadcasters. But what our readings argue is that there are specific things about the nature of social media that make ethical considerations even more important. So we'll go through some of those today. So the first point is immediacy, fragmentation, and permanency. This is referring to types of what online communication is like. It's immediate, it's fragmented, and it's permanent. And all of these things lead us to need standard ethical considerations across social media use. So, first, this idea of online communication being immediate. So, if we think back to pre digital society, if a newspaper printed something wrong, say they got a headline wrong or they misquoted someone, what they would do is the next day the editor would print a retraction in the paper, right? They would print another article that said, oh, we got this wrong, we take back what we said. And most people who read the paper the first day will read the paper the second day and get the retraction. That's just not how communication works online, right? Communication is immediate. So as soon as you get something wrong, or as soon as you put out misinformation, it travels around the globe instantaneously almost. So even if you want to backtrack, right, even if a few minutes later you want to print a retraction and say, oh, I got that wrong, I didn't mean it that way, right, this is what I actually meant. Your miscommunication has already traveled around, right, it's already amplified because of the nature of online communication. Please ignore my cat screaming in the background. That's Figaro. He's a very loudmouth cat, and anytime I need quiet, he just starts screaming at me for my attention. So, the immediate nature of online communication means that we really need to think how to act ethically because it's not as easy for us to retract our mistakes as it might be in print media or in other types of mass communication. The next point, quality of online communication is that it's fragmentary, right? So in pre-digital society, we used to expect to go to one or a few places to gather information, right? There would generally be one kind of key source on something, and then we would branch out from there. Information on the internet is instead organized in networks, right, in different nodes that connect to each other in various ways. So this means we can't expect to go to one source to get all the information we need, right? We often gather information from various sources and put it together ourselves. Another ramification of this fragmentary nature is that information is often presented to us without context. Right, because information is split up across so many locations in our online world, we often approach information, or we come upon information without having the whole story, without having the whole context. And it takes digging, right? It takes bouncing around this network to get a more full picture. The next quality of online communication is that it's permanent. So most people feel that online communication is not permanent, right? Just because of the nature of it. We send out a message and we rarely see it again, right? It might get some comments, it might get some retweets, some reposts, and then we forget about it. And there's so much information online, it just gets buried. We're like, no one's ever going to find that again, right? Because there's so many millions of posts being made every minute. But the truth is, any information that you put online, no matter the terms of service, right, no matter any semblance of privacy or information being deleted, all information in online spaces is aggregated, right? It's traced, it's traceable. So this means we need to be really careful about how we act in online spaces, because any unethical behavior that we conduct is permanent. It's going to stick around. It's able to be found. It's able to creep up later and affect future communications. So this is the nature of online communication, right? That it's immediate, fragmentary, and permanent. And all these things make it necessary for us to think about acting ethically in digital space. A second reason that ethics are so important for digital space is the idea of convergence. So you probably heard about convergence in your intro class. And convergence can refer to a lot of different things. For one, we have convergence in technology. That's the idea that we carry around smartphones now, right? And smartphones are a convergence of a lot of different types of technology, right? They can do all kinds of things. They can record video, they can take images, they can send messages, all right? They can be a calculator, right? All these different kinds of technologies in one device. That's convergence. What I mean by convergence here is in online space, we have convergence in types of communication. So this means in pre-digital society, it was pretty clear what kind of communication we were encountering. So we understood the difference between journalism and public relations and opinion. A great example of this is to think of media grammar, right? Or the rules of media that we come to know as we encounter it. For example, if I see a newspaper next to a tabloid magazine, just by the media grammar, just by the way those things look, I know what kind of information to expect from them, right? A newspaper uses a certain type of paper, where a tabloid is glossier. A newspaper is a particular size, where a tabloid is smaller and the shape of a magazine. A newspaper consists mostly of words, whereas a tabloid consists mostly of images. Right? All of these things, I can look at the different media and I can say, okay, I expect the newspaper to have journalistic information, right? I expect it to be researched, I expect it to be corroborated. You know, I can expect a certain accuracy from that information. In a tabloid, I'm expecting other types of information. I'm expecting speculation. I'm expecting to be entertained. Now, this sort of distinction that we have in pre-digital media becomes really unclear online, right? Because all kinds of different media content is mashed together. So we have journalism next to PR, next to opinion, next to entertainment. And it's not as easy for us to understand the differences between these things, right? Or understanding, okay, this is journalism, I should expect a certain thing from it. Or this is opinion, I should expect a certain thing. It's not as easy for us to make those distinctions online. Another reason why we need to think about acting ethically, because we can't expect our audiences to be able to make these distinctions. And the last point I have on this slide is that multiple and fragmented media channels means multiple effects. So everything I just talked about, online communication being fragmented, immediate, having this quality of convergence. What this means is that it has multiple effects. So you might also remember from your intro class talking about media effects, right? Measuring the effects of media messages. Well, when we go to online spaces, information is so mass and so fragmentary that our effects are always going to be multiple. This means that it's harder for us to determine or try to predict the effects of our communication because there's a multitude of them, because we're not just speaking to any particular audience, because our message is traveling around the globe and getting reconstructed and repurposed in all these different ways that we cannot anticipate. So that's why we say that online communication has multiple effects, which means we need to be even more aware of if our behavior is ethical, because we cannot predict all of the ramifications of our communication. Another reason we need to think about acting ethically when we communicate professionally online is that we can't assume or expect our audience to be media literate. So media literacy refers to being able to understand media messages. But this goes beyond understanding the intent of the message. It also includes being able to analyze the message, understanding where it came from, understanding what it's wanting from you. Is it trying to persuade you in a certain way, right? Who is this message constructed by? And what is their purpose for constructing it, right? What are the factors that go into making this message? You know, does someone have a malicious intent in producing this message, right? Are they wanting something from me as a viewer? That's what we mean by media literacy. And in online spaces, research has shown that we just cannot expect online users to be media literate. So consumers expect blogs and social media to be honest, tell the truth, and advocate a transparent and ethical culture, right? That's what studies have found, that for some reason, social media users expect their information they're encountering to be honest and transparent. Now, this might seem really silly to us, right? Especially as people who study media, right? We know all the false information that gets circulated online. We know how easy it is to falsify online information. But research shows that, social media users are not thinking critically about the messages they encounter. So that puts the onus on us as social media practitioners to act ethically, right? To not mislead these people who are not approaching media critically. It would be super easy to mislead them and take advantage of them. So as social media practitioners, we should be aware of this, and we should be committed to acting ethically and not misleading these people. Another thing about social media users that research has found is that users assume privacy online, which is also seems really crazy, right? Because we know that online communication is permanent and is immediate. And anything you post online is always going to be able to be found later. But for some reason, social media users assume privacy, right? And we should protect that assumption, right? We should not take advantage of that assumption. Social media users also have difficulty distinguishing affiliation. They have trouble determining where their messages come from, which means they're unlikely to recognize if they're being misled. And lastly, social media users rarely consider negative consequences of online activity. And this goes back to the idea that most internet users don't assume their communication is permanent, right? It seems really ephemeral. It seems that you send out a message and it's buried by other messages and no one's ever going to find it. But the truth is, communication online, just like any other kind of communication, can have negative consequences. And social media users are rarely consider these consequences. So this brings us all these points are to show us that we should be thinking about ethics when we interact with others online, because social media users are a rather vulnerable population because of all the instances I just mentioned, right? Because they're not thinking critically about media in general, because they assume privacy, because they assume honesty, because social media and internet communication is fragmentary, is convergence, is multitude, um, because it has multiple effects. This is why we need to be thinking about ethics when we communicate online. So in one of our readings for this week, the author tries to come up with a code of best practices, right? Well, how do we make ethical standards for people using social media in a professional capacity? So, to do this, she uses normative ethics. So, there are many branches of ethics. Normative ethics refers to attempts to arrive at moral standards that regulate right and wrong conduct. Basically, normative ethics is trying to create rules and guidelines for guiding our behavior so that when we're faced with situations, we can apply our ethics in order to act ethically. So, the most famous example of normative ethics is the Golden Rule, which you've probably heard, growing up in school. So, the Golden Rule is do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? Treat others as you would like to be treated. That's an example of normative ethics. Because it's a rule, because it's a guideline we can follow and apply to different situations. And the guideline tells us that as long as we're sticking to this rule, we will act ethically, right? Whatever comes our way. So, under normative ethics, there are 3 different branches. There are virtue theories, duty theories, and consequentialist theories. So, virtue theories deals with virtues. And you probably heard when you were a little kid about virtues, right? How to be a virtuous person. There's a popular saying that says patience is a virtue, right? Some other virtues are being compassionate, right? Being understanding, being a hard worker, right? These are virtues. So, under virtue theories, the idea is that to be an ethical person, you need to be a virtuous person. And as long as you're virtuous, as long as you have these qualities, right? As long as you're patient and kind and compassionate, then you will act ethically. So that's the idea under virtue theories. The next is duty theories. And this is what the author uses to construct her code of best practices for social media practitioners. So duty theories, or the other word for it is I can't say it, deontology. We'll just say duty theories, okay? Deontology, duty theories. The idea behind duty theories is to create rules and guidelines. So the golden rule is a duty theory, right? It's basically saying, as long as you stick to these rules, as long as you apply them to your life, then whatever situation that comes at you, you can act ethically. The last branch of normative ethics is consequentialist theories. So consequentialist theories deals with consequences. What it says is that as long as the consequence is good, whatever action you take to get there is ethical. So the most famous example of this is the scenario that you often hear about a trolley that is going off the rails. And the scenario says that the trolley is full of 15 people. And to save the trolley, you're going to have to change its course and run over one person, killing them. Or you can keep the trolley on its track, everyone on the trolley will die, and the one person will be spared. So under consequentialist theories, the ethically right thing to do would be to sacrifice the one person to save everyone on the trolley. So basically, it is a way to excuse maybe unpleasant actions or, actions that seem unfair as long as the outcome of them are good. So why this doesn't work for making rules and codes for media practitioners is that it's very hard to, actually impossible, to determine the consequences of our actions, right? We can assume the consequences of our actions. We can do research, we can be as sure as we possibly can. But the truth is that we're all humans, right? And we're unperfect, and the world is unpredictable. So this means that it's never a possibility for us as human beings to exactly know the consequences of our actions. So that's why consequentialist theories are not super useful for us in this capacity. So that's why we turn to duty theories, right? The second branch, about making rules and guidelines that can guide our behavior. So this means that we don't need to worry about being a virtuous person, right? Because that's really hard to do, right? To maintain virtues. We don't need to predict the consequences of our actions because that's actually impossible to do. So instead, we focused on duty theories, making rules and guidelines or frameworks that we can follow in order to allow us to act ethically. So the most famous example of duty theories in ethics is Kantian deontology. This is by the philosopher Immanuel Kant. That's K-A-N-T, Kant. So the reason Kantian deontology is useful for us as social media practitioners is because that it's rule-based and it's not focused on specific consequences. So we don't have to predict the future. We don't have to work on being virtuous people or being perfect people. Instead, we have rules that we can follow. And as long as we follow these rules to the best of our ability, it is likely we will be acting ethically. So Kant's most famous idea is called the categorical imperative. A complicated term, but basically what the categorical imperative is that Kant gives us 3 rules. And he said, as long as your ethical guidelines meet these 3 rules, then they will be ethical, right? And by following them, you will be an ethical person. So basically, it's a set of rules for us to construct our rules of ethics. So the first rule is act on that maxiom through which you can at the same time will it to become a universal law. So Kant has a really confusing way of speaking. But what he means here is that work towards universality. What he's saying is that in some order for something to be ethical, we need to be able to say, this is not only the right decision for me, this would be the right decision for any other rational person in the world. So it tries to get past cultural bias, right? It tries to get past this idea of like, well, this is what's right for us in our situation, and it might not be right for other people. Kant says in order for something to be an ethical rule or guideline, it should be universal. You know, what's right in this instance should be right in all instances, or else we cannot say it's the ethical way to act. So take the golden rule, right? The premise behind the golden rule is that it's universal, right? As long as you treat other people how you want to be treated across any kind of situation, you'll be acting ethically. So the second part of the categorical imperative is act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of any other, never simply as a means, but always at the same time as an ends. Once again, a very confusing statement. But the short of this would be treat people as ends, not just means. It's a really complicated way of just saying don't use other people, right? Don't use other people for your own purposes. Always think of the end result for anyone involved in your ethical decision making, right? You should never use other people to get to your end. And the third part of the categorical imperative says, if our conduct as free agents is to have moral goodness, it must proceed solely from a good will. So the short of this is goodwill. Kant is saying that whatever action we take up, we should be done with a good intent. Otherwise, we will not be acting ethically. Now, this doesn't mean that every action we take up, has to be to solve some kind of problem or make someone's life better, right? Often our communication is trying to persuade other people, right? To buy a product, to feel a certain way, to think a certain way. But we can still have good intent behind those messages, right? And the way we do this is by not deceiving, right? By not intentionally causing harm to others. So that's the categorical imperative. First is universality. For this decision to be right for me and my situation, it must be right for any other rational person as well. Second, treat people as ends and not just means. Don't use other people for your own purposes. And last, goodwill. Always have a good intention to your actions. Don't try to deceive or harm other people. So these are the guidelines on which the author bases her code of best practices, right? Her ethical guidelines for social media practitioners. And to put these ideas into practice, she goes through some what she calls ethical fiascos, right? Things that social media practitioners have done in the past that were clearly not ethical. And she uses Kant's categorical imperative to evaluate these things, right? What is it about this communication that wasn't ethical? Because it's usually pretty easy for us to determine, oh, that's ethical or that is not. But it's hard for us to really nail down why, right? Why do we say these things are unethical? So that's why this article is really great, right? Because it breaks these things down, right? Here's a type of communication that clearly wasn't right in some way. Well, here's why it fails Kant's categorical imperative, right? Here's why we can say it's unethical. So the first case study she mentions is the Walmarting Across America flog. And by flog, she just means fake blog. So the Walmarting Across America blog, what it was a blog run by seemingly two citizens who were RVing across the country. And they would stop their RV and they would camp in Walmart parking lots. Because apparently that's something people do quite often. You don't have a place to sleep for the night. You park your camper in a Walmart parking lot and you sleep there, since they're open 24 hours. And so while these people were going around the country and stopping in all these Walmarts to get supplies along the way, they were seemingly amazed by how friendly and great the Walmart workers were. So they started this blog called Walmarting Across America, where they would write about all the different Walmarts that they visited and how great all the workers were. Well, it turns out that this blog was actually sponsored by Walmart, right? It was actually paid communication for Walmart. But nothing on the blog told people that. So the blog was openly deceiving them, right? It was trying to make it appear like, oh, these are two citizens who just happen to like Walmart, right? They aren't getting anything out of this. Well, in truth, they were being sponsored and paid by Walmart to write about how great Walmart was. So they were deliberately concealing their sponsorship. They were flogging or fake blogging. And then they were also astroturfing. So astroturfing is a term that comes from the idea of grassroots movement, right? AstroTurf is a fake type of grass. So grassroots movements are movements that arise from citizens, right? Citizens get behind some kind of initiative, some kind of belief, and they start a movement, right? That's a grassroots movement. So astroturfing is making something seem like a grassroots movement that's actually paid and sponsored, right? So it's very deceptive practice. So the author says that this violates three different things, according to the categorical imperative. One, it violates honesty, right? Because they were deliberately concealing the sponsorship of the blog. They were saying this is a blog by people who just love Walmart, when in reality it was a blog by people who were being paid by Walmart. She also says that it violates dignity and respect. Because she says that's what you're doing when you lie to and deceive people. You're not treating them with dignity and you're disrespecting them. And lastly, she says it violates goodwill. Because while this blog wasn't setting out to harm anyone, right, it was just setting out to make people shop at Walmart, it was still setting out to deceive. And because of that, it was not approached with an intention of goodwill. So this is an example that the author takes, right, the Walmarting Across America blog, and she applies the categorical imperative to it. And she says it fails because of these things, right? It's not honest, it's not coming from a place of goodwill, and it's disrespecting the people it's communicating with. Now, the second case study that she mentions is what she calls microblog fiascos. So these are just tweets on Twitter that posed ethical problems. And why this is important is because she focuses on single tweets, right? This idea that a single tweet can actually be unethical communication, even though it seems so inconsequential, right? Even though it seems so ephemeral. So the first example she gives is by a man who was working for a PR agency that was representing UPS, the delivery company. And he was in a particular city for a conference where he was representing UPS. And while staying in that city, he tweeted, quote, "True confession, but I'm in one of those towns where I scratch my head and say I would die if I had to live here," unquote. So you can imagine that the people living in this town and the people he was working with at the time were not happy about this tweet, right? They were pretty offended. So he was acting unethically in that way, right? And that reflected bad on him. But because he was working professionally as a social media practitioner, this also reflected badly on the company he was representing, right? So this personal opinion that he put on Twitter actually negatively affected UPS, the company he was working for at the time. And he was immediately fired after the tweet was discovered. The other example she gives is a tweet by Kim Kardashian. So the tweet says, quote, "The Carl's Jr. grilled chicken salads came out yesterday. I'm on my way to Carl's Jr. for lunch now. Have you tried them yet?" End quote. So Carl's Jr. is like a burger fast food place. And Kim Kardashian, around this time, I think it was several years ago now, tweeted a lot about Carl's Jr. The thing is, to just a standard social media user, it would just seem like Kim Kardashian really likes eating hamburgers, right? Even though that seems super unlikely, right? Because she's known for her figure, and hamburgers can be unhealthy if you eat a bunch of them. But it just seemed like, okay, for some reason, Kim Kardashian really likes this one burger place. But the truth is, she was being paid $10,000 for every time she tweeted about Carl's Jr., right? Her tweets were being directly sponsored by the fast food place. But nowhere on her Twitter and nowhere in her tweets did she disclose this to her followers. And so the author says that is unethical communication, right? Because you're openly deceiving your followers. You're making it seem like you're a fan of this thing when really you're being sponsored by them. And that doesn't mean that Kim Kardashian isn't a fan, right? She may very well like these hamburgers, but it's still unethical, and that she's not revealing to her followers that she's being paid for this communication. Now, the author makes a point to say, not all social media practitioners act unethically. And she gives two examples of social media sites and apps that she likes, that she thinks are acting ethically. And one is the Taco Bell customer loyalty program, and one is the My Starbucks Idea website. So the Taco Bell customer loyalty program is an app where people talk about tacos and they get coupons and stuff like that. My Starbucks Idea website is the same sort of idea. People share different combinations for coffee drinks, they vote on them, and then they earn rewards. And she said the reason she likes these particular apps and sites is that because the user is getting something out of them. For one, that they earn points and they get rewards, right? They might get discounts or they might get a free taco every once in a while. But she said these apps also create community. They also cultivate community, right? They get users talking to one another. And one reason that's good is because if you create community among your audience on social media, they can hold you accountable, right? You're more likely to act ethically if you have like a watchdog, right, who's going to call you out if you do something wrong. And cultivating community amongst your audience is a good way to do that. Now, one thing she doesn't mention that both of these websites bring up is the idea of user-created content. So user-created content is just a norm of online communication, right? Almost every website we interact with requires us to input information in some way, right? It encourages user-created content. The problem arises when companies or individuals take advantage of their users by soliciting content without compensation. So an example that came out just last week was by Shaquille O'Neal, or Shaq, the professional basketball player. So Shaq tweeted out this video about Shaqtoons, which is a website he created where people can go on and make cartoons, And if he likes your cartoon, he'll put it on his show. So there was a huge backlash by the artistic community on Twitter against this tweet by Shaq. And artists were mad because artists are often not compensated for their work, right? They're paid with exposure, they're paid with experience. They're rarely compensated for their work in any kind of adequate way. And they felt like this campaign by Shaq was just adding to that issue. Because here is Shaq, who could afford to pay animators for their creative work. Instead, he's soliciting a lot of people to do a lot of creative labor, right, without compensation, at the off chance they might be featured on his show. So Shaq responded to this outrage, and he tweeted the following message. He said, quote, "To all my animators out there, I heard you. I love your work, and I want you to feel the love. If your cartoon is selected, you'll be awarded $10,000, and your animation will be shown on my new show, Shaq Life. Can't wait to see what you got." End quote. So he's trying to respond to this backlash by saying, well, whatever cartoon I'll pick, I will pay you for it. But this did little to appease the people who were upset, because he's still not compensating the labor, right? Usually when someone contracts an animator, what they do is they pay the animator for the time it takes them to come up with their idea, right? They sketch, they come up with an idea, they actually do the artwork, they prototype, all these different kinds of things. There's a lot of labor that goes into that process. And with the Shaqtoons example, none of that is being compensated, right? And one person might get $10,000 at the end of it, but no one else gets compensated for all the work they did, right, to populate Shaq's website with cartoons. So that's something we need to be aware of when we're social media practitioners, right? If we're requiring information and user-created content from our followers, are we adequately compensating that, or are we taking advantage of our position, right? Are we essentially stealing people's work because of the position we're in, right? That's an ethical issue we need to think about as we use social media professionally. So that leads us to Bowen's ethical guidelines, or the guidelines that this author comes up with after thinking through these social media scenarios, right? She talks about the categorical imperative, she thinks about the Walmart blog, the Twitter fiascos, the Taco Bell app. She applies all these things together and she comes up with a list of ethical guidelines. And there's 4 of them. It's be fair, be transparent, empathize, I can't say that word, emphasize clarity, and encourage the good. So under be fair, treat publics with respect, do not engage in deception, avoid secrecy, and disclose all needed information, right? So do not publish content with the intent to deceive. Next is be transparent. Identify paid speech, distinguish between personal and professional speech, and check relevant facts, right? Don't present something as your opinion if it's sponsored content, right? Even if it lines up with your own opinion, you must always make your users aware when something is sponsored, right? Because that changes the way that they will interact with that message. Because they'll realize that that message is trying to convince them of something, right? It wants something from them, and they need to be aware of that when they encounter it. Next is emphasize clarity. Maintain responsibility and maintain goodwill, right? So this goes back to Kant's idea of goodwill. Always be seeking to not deceive and not do harm when you communicate. And lastly, encourage the good. Help build connectedness, engagement, and community. Build trust and meet expectations. This goes back to why Bowen likes the Taco Bell and the Starbucks apps, right? She likes this idea of building community among your users. She feels like that's a way to give back to the people who are interacting with you online. So that's what I wanted to go over about ethical guidelines. Now, there are no set ethical guidelines for social media practitioners yet, right? Because this is such a new field and new phenomenon. So, like in the field of journalism, there's a set of ethical guidelines, right, that have been established over time that the Society for Professional Journalists keeps and updates. And all journalists agree to these, right? In order to work as a journalist and be respected in this country, in this field, you have to follow these ethical guidelines. And because of that, we can expect certain things from journalistic information, right? We can expect it to be well researched, we can expect it to be as objective as possible, and all these kinds of things. At least that's what we hope from our journalistic information. But online, we don't have these codes yet, right? We don't have these rules that help us act ethically. So that was the point of going through this lesson, right? How can we, since there aren't standard rules yet, how can we establish our own guidelines to ensure that we're interacting ethically in online spaces? So that's all I have for this week. Remember to answer the discussion question and send any questions my way. Thanks.